Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into Eastory's Germany's plan to win World War I. Not sure what specifically this is about, if it's just a layout of the Schlieffen plan or some more specific thought process once Russia's in the war as quickly as they are. I'm not sure. I'm going to do this video and then parts 8 and 9 of the Hannibal series will be out later this afternoon. But we're going to start with this one. Let's get into it.
Imperial Germany, country famous for military fashion and war plans. In fact, in this video we are going to see what were the German plans to win World War I and how they changed. In early 20th century, the alliance of Germany and Austria was opposed by the alliance of Russia and France. The strength of the alliances was quite equal, so an inconclusive and bloody war was to be expected. The German army wanted none of it and looked at its potential enemies for weaknesses. It was believed that one of the weaknesses of the Entente nations was that due to its size and poor infrastructure, it would take Russia several weeks more than Germany to get its entire army to the front. Until that time, Germany had to contend only with France and had an upper hand. The Germans wanted to use the first weeks of the war to inflict a blow from which their enemies would not be able to recover. The question was where to do it. They could attempt to destroy the Russian forces stationed on the border, but due to the long distances of the Eastern Front, the damage would have been limited. The distances in the west were much shorter, and it was possible to inflict more damage to the French army. For this, the Germans had to draw the French into a decisive battle. The best way to make the French to fully commit their troops was to invade France, but the French had prepared just for this occasion and had built a line of fortifications on the Franco-German border. So the Germans decided to bypass the line by moving through Belgium, then defeat the French army in a decisive battle, forcing France to make peace. Then they would move the bulk of their forces east and use the newly gained superiority to defeat Russia. The pieces were all set, and all that was needed was someone to light the fuse.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, this is Germany's plan after they ditch Otto von Bismarck, right? This is totally against Bismarckian policies or strategy for how Germany should conduct itself in European geopolitics. So that's the first thing. Bismarck's whole thing was Russia stayed on the side of Germany. So if any conflict broke out, Germany and Russia would be on the same side. And the thought process was essentially they could handle the rest of Europe as long as those two were together. Wilhelm sacks Bismarck and gets him out of the way, then he starts this different sort of expansionist policies and he kind of snubs Russia, and Russia and France kind of start an alliance, and it's a whole thing that happens building up to World War I, where Germany basically, instead of tying itself to Russia, ties itself to what the quote that they give is the fettered corpse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So good choice there. Also, the layout of the Schlieffen plan is basically what Germany does in World War II. So the thought process is they don't go through the Ardennes. They basically swing a huge column through Belgium, and they have like a hammer and anvil, right? So they have the line at the Franco-German border, and then they swing the troops around in France around the French lines, and they are going to be the hammer that swings down to the anvil that is the German line at the border. That's the thought process here. There's some different ideas once they get started on how far they swing out. Like, are they going all the way to the English Channel? So there's some discrepancies, particularly once the plan gets going. But the overall general thought process is send the huge force through France, swing down, knock out the French armies, and then move all the troops to the Eastern Front and get ready for a war with Russia. Russia was not the Soviet Union of the Second World War. You could argue kind of where they were good and bad, but the big thing is they do not have the ability to mechanize like World War II Soviet Union does. The World War II Soviet Union was able to pretty pretty quickly once they got going. Start spitting out planes and tanks and trucks and, all of these mechanized units. World War One, Russia does not have the capability to do anything like that. It is an empire hanging on by a thread. This war is going to be the catalyst to snap that thread.
On the 28th of June 1914, Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated and declarations of war followed. Now, Germany was able to implement its plan and moved into Belgium. They managed to advance into France, but their plan as a whole proved to be too optimistic and they failed to trap and destroy the French army, and fighting resulted in a stalemate. Also, Britain joined the Entente and enacted a maritime blockade on Germany. Trench warfare set in on the Western Front, making attacking difficult. It meant that it would be more complicated for Germany to defeat France, but at the same time made it unlikely that Britain and France could invade Germany. Meanwhile, in the east, the absence of the German army had made itself felt. They managed to keep control over East Prussia, but Russian army had made inroads into Austria-Hungary, threatening to knock it out of the war and tied up many Central Powers units. In 1915, the Germans decided to go over on defensive in the west and stabilize the situation in the east to free up the troops. The Russian army had prepared for a short war, and its weak weapons industry could not yet adequately supply its troops. They were unable to...
Okay, that is the biggest understatement of all time, that they could not adequately supply their troops. The Russians are sending troops into battle without rifles. Okay? They are so inadequately supplied that they do not have a rifle going into a war. So, they'll send a bunch of troops out there, they won't have a firearm, and their job is basically to shadow other Russian soldiers and pick up their guns when they die. The Russians are not prepared for this war in any significant way. They have some troops in places pre-war that makes it seem like, it makes it seem like they were much more ready for this war than Germany predicted. But as far as arms and supplies and stuff, like I said, Russia's hanging on by a thread at this point. And if they would have been savvy or supplied or, just generally well led, the Russians could have knocked the Austrians out of the war probably pretty early. The Austrians, every time they go to do something in this war, will absolutely suck. They do nothing well. It is just, how to lose a war for dummies between Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the southern Eastern Front. But it's just a ton of bloodshed on both sides, but it's so brutal. Neither one of them are very good at this whole, war thing. So they could have knocked the Austro-Hungarian Empire out early. They do not, because they also are not good at war. So it becomes sort of a stalemate. The Germans are going to make headway at the northern part of the front under Hindenburg and Ludendorff, I believe, is who they have out there early in the war. They do really well. They end up getting sent to the Western Front later on because of how well they do on the Eastern Front. But it's just a different game. The Russians just, aren't very good at war right now. They don't want to fight it.
To resist the Central Powers and took a defensive stance by shortening the length of the front twofold. In this time, Bulgaria was convinced to join the Central Powers, which allowed them to defeat Serbia. This was, however, offset by the entry of Italy into the war. The Eastern Front was now secured, although Russia still remained in the war. In the early 1916, the situation of the Central Powers had been stabilized, but the British blockade was slowly sapping their strength, and in order not to lose the war, they had to inflict a decisive defeat on the Entente. In the east, it would be difficult for them to reach the areas vital for Russian war effort due to vast distances and poor infrastructure. Even if the Germans would be able to make substantial advances, it was hard to make Russia surrender. Operations in the east would be more difficult than in the previous year, as the Russian army had shortened its defensive lines and was beginning to overcome the supply shortages. Although the Central Powers could have been successful in Russia, they would probably find themselves committing a lot of their troops without removing Russia from the war. In the west, there was trench warfare, and German attacks needed to expend a lot of men and material resources to break through the Entente defenses. In case of German advance, the French and the British could pull back, inflicting vast casualties and winning slowly by attrition. Or they could counterattack, thus making the losses more equal, but denying the Germans any territory. Neither of the options could lead to a decisive German victory. Instead, the plan was to make the Entente attack the Germans and expend their manpower on strong defenses. After they had sustained enough losses, the Germans would have the superiority needed to go on an offensive and win the war. It was not an easy task to make the Entente adopt such a suicidal strategy, so a complicated and cunning plan was devised. The Germans would attack the fortress of Verdun, where they could create a great tactical advantage for themselves, but which was symbolically vital for the French. The plan relied on three assumptions. After the initial German successes, the French will not withdraw from Verdun, but will at any cost attempt counterattacks to regain the land around it. The British and the French shall launch an attack on the German defenses in other sectors to ease the German pressure on Verdun. During these operations, the French and the British would suffer much more casualties than the Germans. The first two assumptions were correct. The French held on to Verdun, and the Entente attacked at Somme to help with the defense. But the third assumption was not. During these operations, the Entente had suffered the loss of 1 million men, but the German casualties were only slightly smaller. The Germans had made another miscalculation. They had assumed that in 1916 the Eastern Front would be quiet. But the entry of Italy to the war in the previous year had divided the Austro-Hungarian forces, and the measures to improve the armament of the Russian army began to kick in. The Russians carried out a successful offensive, pushing the Austro-Hungarian forces back. Soon the situation deteriorated even further, as the success of Russian attacks convinced Romania to join the war against the Central Powers. And
yeah, so again, if Russia was in a position with leadership or really anything to actually implement a cohesive war strategy, they could have knocked out the Austro-Hungarian Empire relatively early. The Germans did not want to send a bunch of manpower down there. The thought process was that it was another empire, that it was, it had its own manpower and resources and could take care of itself. The Germans soon found out that, they suck. That the empire was basically dead, that the army was basically dead, that they really, couldn't sustain a war. Also, on the Western Front, the idea with Verdun, the quote given from the German side was, "We are going to bleed France white." So the thought process with Verdun is, we are going to take the high ground around Verdun, and then we are going to essentially make it a killing hole, right? And as we do this, the French are going to send more and more and more men in so that we don't take the city. But the more men they send in, they're sending them into our killing hole, and we'll just kill and kill and kill until we bleed France white of all of their manpower, right? That's the idea. That's the thought process. It does not go as smoothly. They do well right off the bat. The Germans do. They take a bunch of the high ground. They set up guns. Like, things go really well, but they lose high ground. There's counterattacks by the French that are done very quickly. The Germans don't move as quickly as they probably should have. It's a handful of circumstances that makes it, not work as well as they had planned. But this idea that the Germans have, that they are going to give up territory or give up distance in order to take casualties. Ludendorff will take this to the extreme later in the war, where he is doing a defense in depth strategy, and he will give up all sorts of terrain and all this ground in order to take as many casualties as he possibly can from the Entente.
and now German reserves had to be dispatched to save the Eastern Front from collapse. The Central Powers had failed to inflict a decisive defeat on their enemies and were mostly on the defensive again, with the British blockade bringing their defeat nearer by the day. It was time to think outside the box and adopt creative and risky strategies, or war was lost. The risks associated with these strategies were huge. Germany now attempted to knock Russia and Britain out of the war. A revolution had taken place in Russia, but the new government decided to carry on with the war. German plan was to support the influence of the left-wing political parties in Russia, hoping that they would create internal strife, causing Russia to make peace. They allowed Lenin to travel back to Russia from Switzerland and allegedly gave large subsidies to his Bolshevik party.
Yeah, again, allowed is an understatement there. They got Lenin on a train back to Russia specifically to start a revolution and get Russia out of the war.
Strategy was risky, as the success of socialists in Russia could very well cause instability or even revolution in Germany itself. The other plan was to starve Britain into surrendering by using the German submarine fleet to sink the British shipping. For this strategy to be effective, the Germans had to sink all the ships carrying cargoes to Britain, which included the ships from neutral countries. This carried the risk of war with these nations. Unrestricted submarine warfare had been adopted earlier, but later discontinued in the fear that America would declare war on Germany. Now the situation was deemed to be desperate enough to risk it, and unrestricted submarine warfare was reintroduced. At the same time, Germany attempted to free up troops by reducing the length of the Western Front and substituting men with weapons. Despite these efforts, during 1917 they couldn't spare troops for more than maintaining the current state, which would ultimately result in defeat. Entente offensives in the west were repelled and sizable forces were dispatched to Romania in order to seize its resources. Italian army was pushed back in order to keep Austria-Hungary in the war. It was all on the out-of-the-box measures by this time. The strategy directed against Britain failed totally, as the adoption of convoy system reduced the efficiency of the German submarines and the United States did enter the war against Germany.
Okay, so that's not exactly how that happened. The German unrestricted U-boat warfare was extremely effective early on. I mean, extremely effective. They were basically doing the same thing to Britain that Britain was doing to Germany with the naval blockade. They were blockading Britain. The issue with Germany was that it was too hit and miss. So throughout the war, they start it and stop it and start it and stop it. So they'll get Britain into a vulnerable situation and then they'll stop. And then they'll start up again. And then they'll stop. And so it's just this constant back and forth. And so, yeah, later in the war, Britain decides that, and ironically, it is the civilian leadership that suggests the convoy system. The military leadership actually says, you guys are too damn dumb to be making decisions. If we put a bunch of boats in one place, then that will just make them easier to find, and we'll lose a bunch of boats instead of just one. The civilian leadership said, no, we think this will work. Well, it ended up working. Why? Well, because the ocean is huge, and it's actually hard to just stumble upon a ship or a group of ships. But also with the convoys, you aren't just getting one ship through when you get through. You're getting a bunch of ships through. So it ends up being a super successful strategy for Britain using the convoys. And then, yes, obviously, I've talked on this channel ad nauseum about how much I hate Woodrow Wilson. He is one of the worst, if not the worst president in U.S. history. I can't stand him. I will do a video at some point on why I despise him as a person. However, he makes the case to Congress that they're already in the war. That the U.S. is already in the war, whether they like it or not. Germany's sinking U.S. ships. They're not able, there are ports are backed up in the U.S. because there are ships that are afraid to go across the ocean because they don't want to get shot by a U-boat. So Wilson makes his case, and then, yeah, the U.S. gets into the war late, and that pisses some people off, but they get in.
Russia, however, was another case. Russian army was weakened by the revolution, which allowed the Central Powers to advance and improve their positions. The Bolsheviks managed to increase their influence in Russia and deposed the government. They had to demobilize most of the army, but refused to make peace with Germany and attempted to incite revolution. The Germans managed to keep the situation under control. In order to resolve the situation in the east, the Germans went on an offensive. The Russian army had lost its fighting capabilities, and the German advance took over large parts of the former Russian Empire, forcing the Bolsheviks to agree to their terms. By this time, the resource stocks had become critical, and it seemed that unless the situation improved, defeat was only a question of time. Despite that, a window of opportunity had been created. The freed-up troops from the east gave the Germans the numbers needed to have a chance to launch an offensive in the west. By now, both the Entente and the Germans had developed better ways to break through the enemy's trenches, and it was possible to undertake a decisive offensive. However, there was a catch. The Germans needed to defeat the Entente before the newly arriving American troops would make the odds overwhelming. They launched an all-out offensive. The attacks took large amounts of territory, but caused many casualties to the Germans. In the end, the line held, and the Germans were unable to deliver a decisive blow. It became clear that Germany was unable to win, and the Entente armies launched a counter-offensive. The Germans attempted to hold on to captured lands in order to secure a better peace settlement, but their army was spent and began to fall back towards the German border. As all was lost, Germany finally agreed to surrender. So, was Germany doomed from the start? Can you think of strategies which could have ended the war in a German victory? Share these ideas in the comments.
Yeah, I'm curious about what you guys think about that. Could Germany have won World War I? I'm obviously working on the video on how historians think Germany could have won World War II, but I'm curious about y'all's thoughts on World War I. What was the better strategy? What could they have done, or could they have done anything to win the war? Does von Moltke get a bad rap for the way he implemented the Schlieffen plan, or was it flawed from the start? You know, what are you guys' thoughts overall on the handling of the war from the German perspective? Like I said, the next Hannibal video will be out later this afternoon. Like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you guys then.